Hello, I'm Desiree Frazier, host of the award-winning news program, Mississippi Edition. We bring you conversations about the latest news from across the Magnolia State. Whether it's politics, healthcare, or education, you'll hear in-depth discussions on issues that matter to you. So join us each weekday morning at 8:30 on MPB Think Radio, or download the podcast, listen through the app, and online.
The nation's longest-running traveling celebration of traditional arts, the National Folk Festival, comes to downtown Jackson for the first time, November 7th through the 9th. A fun-filled weekend for the entire family, exploring roots, richness, and variety of American culture. Non-stop music and dance, folk life demonstrations, hands-on children's activities, signature Southern foods, crafts, and more showcasing the best of America, the best of Mississippi, all free. We'll see you in November. More at nationalfolkfestival.com.
What's happening in Mississippi? You found the Sit Down with Russ Latino right here on MPB Think Radio, where we explore the ideas and people that are shaping Mississippi. We are going to be joined today by the one and only Jere Nash, an incomparable author on Mississippi politics and Mississippi history. He'll join us in the second segment and stick with us for the rest of the hour. But before that, I wanted to go around the horn a little bit and talk about some news that has been breaking. Now, Germaine, you were telling me before we came on today that you very purposefully try to avoid consuming too much news.
I use the protect your peace method.
I think that's not a bad method for blood pressure. I have mentioned this on here before, but probably about 10 to 12 years ago, I can't remember the exact time frame, I decided to stop watching cable news. Mm-hmm. And nothing has been better for my general well-being than not seeing 24/7 propaganda and hate.
Right.
And I say that without sort of partisan leaning, in the sense that I think that MSNBC promotes their own form of propaganda and fear. I think Fox promotes its own form of propaganda and fear.
Yeah.
And that sort of across the spectrum of cable news, the way they keep you interested is by making you either scared or angry.
That's the model.
Which is the model.
Yeah, it's the model.
And so, I choose to tap out of the model. I read most of my news.
Yes.
Very rarely does that make me angry.
You can't hear tone in text.
You can't. And this actually will say this part does. Social media is just all over the place, right? You get to see clips and whatnot. So yesterday, the president was at the United Nations.
Okay.
Giving a speech in part on Ukraine and on some broader topics. During the course of the speech, his teleprompter went out, and so he just essentially talked off the cuff for a while. And then while he and Melania, the First Lady, were riding down the escalator at the United Nations, it stopped. And so apparently the Secret Service is looking into whether or not there were staff at the UN that sabotaged the president yesterday. The more substantive, interesting thing, though, is his comments on Ukraine appear to show a real shift. So if you were to watch, the first 8 months of his presidency, I think you would look at it and go, maybe he's not pro-Russia, but he's certainly not pro-Ukraine. In sort of the tone that he was setting. Remember the Zelensky Oval Office appearance that went awry with the vice president, the president. But yesterday, he basically came out and said, I think Ukraine can win this war and take back the territory that it's lost, which is a huge shift from we've got to end it now. Ukraine has to make all these concessions. So that was an interesting policy moment. On Monday, the president did a different kind of presser with the Secretary of Health, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., in which they sort of speculated that prenatal Tylenol could cause autism, and that children should also not take Tylenol if they can avoid it. They almost sort of admitted that it wasn't based on any sort of real rooted science.
Okay.
But the president advised pregnant women that if they could, to just tough it out if they had a fever. I will say this. look, Steve Jobs died a number of years ago. Obviously a brilliant guy. We all have our iPhones in our pockets. Yeah. Steve Jobs had a less aggressive form of pancreatic cancer. And he was told by doctors when it was detected, it's early enough for us to do surgery. We think we can remove the tumor. You will recover. He didn't want his body opened up. And he literally said that he regretted it as he was dying, that he didn't want his body opened up. And so he chose alternative medicine, acupuncture, green tea, all this stuff. And he died because of it. He died because he ignored medical and scientific advice. I worry that we're in a period of time where we are using speculation and creating fear in a mother. And there's no more powerful instinct in the whole world than the maternal instinct. And I don't know this because I'm a dude, but my wife would tell me that, right? And I see it in the way that she protects our children. And so when you realize that, and you realize the potential danger of the highest office in the country telling mothers to tough it out without any real scientific evidence, it's scary, and I think it's reckless. I would just say this. There was a study that was done at Harvard back in 2014 by a scientist who was an expert witness for a trial lawyer that was trying to link Tylenol to autism. So this is a familiar story to the measles, mumps, and rubella situation where the first and only report to ever link MMR to autism was done by a trial lawyer's expert witness, a guy who lost his medical license after it because he had fabricated the data. So there's that report, but then there's every other report on this subject that says that they can identify no causal link. There was one done a sibling study that was done with 2.5 million children where they could show siblings that had a mom that had taken Tylenol for one birth and not for another birth. And there was no increased incidence in autism in those that had had Tylenol during the pregnancy.
Yeah.
So you've got that all out there. Simultaneously, you've got real evidence that fevers can cause autism. So the Columbia Mailman School of Public Health, which is the top public health school in the entire country, did a huge study that showed that there was a 40% increase in autism diagnoses of mothers that had an uncontrolled fever in the second trimester. And for mothers that had 3 or more fevers within the second trimester, a 300% increase in autism. On top of that, we've known for decades that fevers during pregnancy cause all sorts of birth defects. So if your advice based on not great science is to tell mothers to tough it out, and to avoid Tylenol, which can help tamp down fevers, which we know cause these conditions, it seems off base to me.
The question that I have, though, is the model of, how sometimes you're scrolling on social media, and not to say that's what the president did or anything, but you're scrolling and you find old news, and old news pops up on your feed, and you take that old news as fact, and then you reiterate that old news as fact to somebody else. Is that possibly what could have happened in this situation, because possibly maybe this came across somebody's timeline and it was old news? But the study that you just said that fevers are more linked to autism didn't come back up on the timeline as old news. So you only got one side of the old news that came back into your vision of play, and now you're taking that and you're spreading it like telephone.
Maybe. I think he's relying really heavily on RFK Jr. and RFK has had Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has had these positions for a long time. He also was a plaintiff's lawyer involved in some of this litigation, but he's had these positions on Tylenol and vaccines for a very long time. Here's what I'd say is science is corruptible because every industry is corruptible. Science is capable, even if not being corrupted, of sunk cost fallacies, right? The idea that, hey, we've invested all this intellectual capital and money behind a theory that this works, so it's really hard to change our mind that we're wrong. But the presidency and the Department of Health and Human Services has at its disposal a litany of scientists, really unchecked resources. If you want to be scientific about showing this link, the way to do that is to use the resources that are available to you and prove the hypothesis before you author the hypothesis and medical advice. It would be Russ's take. I know there are people who disagree with me on this. I worry that somehow science has become a Republican versus Democratic issue or conservative versus liberal issue. And COVID had a lot to do with that, the feeling that a lot of our liberties were taken away with us on the basis of things that people didn't actually know but spoke about with certainty. I get that trepidation. I think if we're going to toss the baby out with the bathwater and bring back dysentery and consumption and life expectancies in the 40s, that's a real problem. And so I would just say that, like, Russ's personal hope is that everybody take 5, touch grass.
Yes.
Maybe listen to your doctor first, because I don't think your doctor is trying to harm you, right? And I do think that they know more than you about medicine. Just my take. So there's that. The other thing I want to mention this morning is Jimmy Kimmel's return to air. Now, what I'm about to say, at least half of our audience will disagree with me on. So I think Jimmy Kimmel is a sanctimonious gas bag. I think he made his career starting on The Man Show by asking buxom women to jump up and down on trampolines and other really sophomoric stunts. And so I have a hard time hearing his lecture. I think he chose to kind of smarmly alienate half of the country by really sort of being catty towards conservatives and Republicans. All of that said, that the consequence of that is that his audience has gone down, the financial picture has gone down for the show. The natural progression of things to happen would be that eventually ABC looks at that format and says, we're losing money on this. And as a business, we're not going to continue to invest in losing money on it. So the problem that I've got is that what happened with the FCC and Brendan Carr in some ways gave an excuse for the initial taking of Kimmel off the air. But it also created a scenario where if government can threaten to pull broadcasting license because they don't agree with the viewpoint expressed, that doesn't just affect one side. Like right now, some people may be happy that Kimmel was taken off air for 4 days. But, you know, the ability to shut down a Kirk hater for saying what they believe using the force of government, not just a private company's decision, the force of government is dangerous, because what's tomorrow is that eventually the people that are cheering that decision won't be in political power. Their ideological opponents will be in political power, and they will use that same power to say, hey, you know, pastor who's preaching traditional marriage, we're going to punish you for preaching traditional marriage. In an ideal world, there's enough room for people to say their piece and for the market to decide how much value we give to them saying that piece, right? And the way the market works is ABC saying, hey, we've lost all this audience. This is no longer a viable program. I think what the FCC has done is to intercede in a way that sets up a scenario where free speech becomes dangerous or becomes in danger. Now, look, I would say there's also some hypocrisy in people who are criticizing the FCC, because there's substantial evidence that Joe Biden and the White House that he was under put pressure on social media companies to censor conservatives, to shut down certain kinds of speech as well. So this is not the first time the White House has used its power to intimidate speech. My argument would be like free speech is a valuable thing. It is the hallmark of a free society. Because if you can control what people say, you can control what people hear. And if you can control what people hear, then you can control what people think. You can control people. And so in my mind, a true free speech warrior would say, hey, look, it wasn't good when the Biden White House put pressure on social media companies to censor conservative thought. And it's not good when the Trump FCC puts pressure on ABC to censor or somehow impede liberal thought. Let the market decide what the consequences are, not government. Of course, Kimmel is now back on air after a 4-day hiatus. You know, I think it'll be interesting to see what the White House does with this moving forward. They've threatened already to sue ABC. So we're living in strange and wondrous times. Russ will stop his rant. We'll take a break. When we come back, the one and only Jere Nash. Be right back.
Friday.
Deep Roots, where every story matters and every voice can be heard. At MPB, we stand with our local communities, bringing you the voices of those who shape our state through local programming that reflects our culture across small towns to big cities, from the Delta to the coast. We tell the stories that define us, from the music that carries our voices to the leaders who inspire change. MPB brings you the heart of Mississippi, celebrating Mississippi one story at a time. MPB, your stories, our mission.
At the Mississippi Arts and Entertainment Experience in Meridian, we believe in the power of the arts, storytelling, and education, just like Mississippi Public Broadcasting. MPB connects communities across the state with quality programs that inform, inspire, and engage. Their audience is loyal and appreciative of businesses that support public broadcasting, which makes underwriting on MPB a smart investment. Join us in supporting MPB. Learn more at mpbfoundation.org.
When the weather turns severe, when breaking news affects your family, when Mississippi needs answers, MPB is there. We provide real-time emergency alerts, trusted news coverage, and live broadcasts of emergency updates. Available on TV, radio, and online. MPB is on the air and by your side every day of the year. Because when it matters most, Mississippi turns to MPB, Mississippi's trusted source. MPB, your stories, our mission.
Back to the Sit Down right here on MPB Think Radio. I'm your host, Russ Latino. My guest today is Jere Nash. Jere has written a number of books with a number of people. Mississippi Politics, 2 editions of Mississippi Politics that was written with Andy Taggart.
Right.
And for years, you and Taggart had that red-blue program that you did where you kind of shared your perspective from both sides of the aisle. And then you wrote Mississippi Fried Politics, I think also with Andy. Is that right?
Andy, right.
And then your latest book, Reconstruction in Mississippi, 1862 to 1877, is out now.
Right.
You can pick it up on Amazon. I was looking at it this morning, $25. It's a good price.
That is a
reasonable
good price.
buy.
Mm-hmm.
You can get it on Audible, too, if you'd like to listen.
You can also buy it at all of your independent Mississippi bookstores.
Good point. Good point. So Lemuria, and I know you have a book signing coming up at Lemuria October 14th.
Yes, sir.
And then maybe one on the coast.
Right now we have 11 set up around the state.
Okay.
Oxford, Clarksdale, Greenville, Pass Christian, Ocean Springs, here in Jackson with Lemuria, Hattiesburg. So I've been very fortunate that a number of local bookstores and friends are hosting events to promote the book.
I got a message before the program today that when you were teaching at Millsaps, that both Governor Tate Reeves and GOP Chairman Mike Hurst were in one of your classes together. Did you know now or then that they were going to become governor and the chairman of the state GOP?
No, I did not. And, of course, I mentioned to you off air, and I'm going to take this shameless opportunity to mention this on air. The University Press has asked Andy and me to write a 3rd edition of our Mississippi Politics book that covered contemporary political history in Mississippi, and we're working on that now. And maybe next year at this time, you'll have Andy and me on your show to promote that book.
Well, that would be great. And look, I always like hearing from Andy as well. Certainly a very knowledgeable guy in terms of sort of the progression of conservatism. And certainly a knowledgeable guy, too, about Mississippi history.
No question.
It was always fun to listen to the two of you banter back and forth because it was civil banter, mostly civil banter, from different perspectives. And we've lost some of that ability to have that kind of debate.
But my point, Russ, I was going to make when I 4 or 5 weeks ago interviewed Governor Reeves for that book. This new book, the new edition, will cover the last 20 years. And, of course, Governor Reeves has been up in the middle of a lot of it. So we had a very nice long interview, and he made the point in that interview, which he's made several times earlier. Now, I was in your class at Millsaps, and what he always tells people is that he remembers that I once made the claim that yard signs are worthless in a political campaign. And he likes to repeat that to other political consultants around.
That's certainly true. The
It is
yard
true.
signs are worthless, but people love to see their names on the road. The other thing that's increasing, and I want to talk about your book, but the other thing that's increasingly becoming worthless or of lower worth are television ads. But by golly, campaign consultants still want to sell those.
But in a state like Mississippi, the majority of the voters, if you quiz them about where they get their political news, they still get it from network television. And it's as you know, it's relatively inexpensive to buy television in Mississippi.
It is. That is true. That is true.
And you continue to reach a large number of people who are going to likely vote. And for bang for your buck, it's the way to go.
Okay.
I think.
Well,
Still.
and maybe I'm thinking about it more in terms of national campaigning, where
Correct.
there are certainly markets where it's not true that people are still primarily watching network television. I would say that will become less true in Mississippi too at some point, because my generation doesn't watch a whole lot of network television, and younger generations certainly don't watch a whole lot of network television.
No, but what happens is, again, snippets of all of that end up on social media platforms.
Sure, that's true.
And ads typically follow those snippets, and so people are seeing ads and seeing information in ways that you and I never did that when we were growing up.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Social media for a lot of people, probably 40 and younger, or even some people who are slightly over 40, has become a primary way of consuming information. It's scary at times. So let's talk about the.
Well, it's just like your show is available live on YouTube.
It is.
I mean, who would ever have thought something like that would happen for a radio show?
And Spotify and Apple and all sorts of other platforms if you ever miss a show. So let's talk about the book. What was the inspiration to write this? How long had you been thinking about putting this on paper?
So, let me first ask you a question, if I could. Before you saw the book, and you and I have had conversations about this, when you heard the term Reconstruction, what did Russ Latino think?
I thought about the tumultuous period that followed the Civil War. I thought about sort of the uniqueness of the federal government, the way that they set up guidelines that in some ways allowed for a political scenario that would have never happened organically. So certainly if you think about like Hiram Revels or Bruce K. Blanche or, on down the line, I mean, we had an African-American lieutenant governor, an African-American speaker during the 1870s. Those are things that probably would have never happened organically. So it was this very interesting sort of political, I don't know how to describe it. Middle ground's not the right word, but an unnatural political setting that happened because of the tumult of the Civil War.
And the imposition of military control by the Republicans
Correct.
in Congress. Well, that's actually a fascinating observation about that period. I knew none of that and have known none of that growing up, and even being a political consultant for 40 years. So when Andy Taggart and I put together the deal with the University Press to write Mississippi Politics, sort of a history of contemporary Mississippi campaigning and legislative action, we started with 1976, as you know, the last time Mississippi voted for our Democratic presidential nominee, Jimmy Carter. And we wanted to find out why that was the last. And we wanted to explore with a variety of people, what was it about 76 that caused that? Well, Russ, the more we got into it, the more we realized we couldn't talk about 1976 without understanding what came before 1976. So I went and interviewed lots of Republican activists who were there at the beginning of the modern day Republican Party, Wirt Yerger and Buddy Clum and Victor Mavar and Clark Reed and Billy Munger and B.B. McClendon and that whole crowd. And I got them talking about what it was like for them to start a Republican Party in the early 1950s. And Russ, they all said when they were confronting officials and voters, particularly people active in the Democratic Party, many of these Democrats would say, well, it was Republicans who freed the slaves. It was Republicans who gave us Reconstruction. It was Republicans who brought military control on Mississippi. And they all knew that history because they were confronted with it. And I knew none of it. I'd been a political consultant for 40 years, living in the present, and hadn't read any history and was never taught that history growing up. And so I just kept going back, and Andy and I kept going back all the way back to Reconstruction, 1865 to 1875, and all of a sudden realized Democrats were able to use what happened during those 10 years to promote their party and to promote segregation and Jim Crow for 90 years. And Republicans had to overcome what happened during those 10 years in order to rebuild a party. And the Wirt Jurgens of the world recognized that. They had to change the dynamic, and that's what they did. And the more I got into it, the more I realized it was worth writing a book about. And lucky for me, Russ, the University Press and Archives and History and the Mississippi Historical Society have this Heritage of Mississippi series where they produced a series of books about a series of times in Mississippi or periods in Mississippi. And no one had yet volunteered to take the one on Reconstruction. And I asked for it, and they gave it to me, and so we wrote it.
So, one, I can't wait to read it. Two, when we get back from break, I want to talk a little bit about what's in it.
Okay.
And I know, as an example, you shared an interesting story with Magnolia Tribune about the period of figuring out what public education was going to look like. And so there are all sorts of interesting historical points in that period that I think had a lot of impact on what Mississippi looks like today.
No question.
We're talking to Jere Nash. We'll be back right after this.
Since 1970, MPB has been enriching the lives of Mississippians.
Everything we do gives us the chance to grow and learn.
With your support, we are always there whenever and wherever you need us. Together through the years, together in the future. Please consider making a donation at mpbfoundation.org. MPB, your stories, our mission.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bobby Rush. As a blues man, I love Mississippi Public Broadcasting. If you support Mississippi music and their local programming, donate now, right now, and become a member today, not tomorrow. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Doesn't matter how big or small, but we prefer big. Thank you very much.
Every parent wants their child to grow, to explore, and to dream big. At MPB, we're proud to support families and teachers across Mississippi with trusted educational programming and resources that inspire learning and spark imagination. From PBS Kids Favorites to digital tools and early learning support, MPB is here for young minds, engaged classrooms, and families who believe in the power of learning at every age. Empowering families, inspiring learners. MPB, your stories, our mission.
Right here on MPB Think Radio. I'm your host, Russ Latino. We're talking today with author, political strategist, all-around good guy, Jere Nash. Jere, before the break, you were talking a little bit about your inspiration for the book and sort of the recognition you had that as you studied modern political history, it was necessary to understand how we got to that point. And that a lot of that leads back to this period of Reconstruction because in many ways, although Mississippi had been a state since, 1817 or something, right? I should know that, but I think it's 1817.
It is.
In many ways, that period right after the Civil War was the remaking of a state and the political structures that would be in place. And then candidly also the backlash to that remaking, right? So when Reconstruction ended, there obviously was this massive backlash to what had happened in terms of federal imposition on state government and state policy. Tell me, what are the most interesting things you learned as you studied that period?
All right. So I'm gonna. One of the interesting things I had to grapple with, which I'm going to ask you. Mississippi became a state in 1817. As you know, we celebrated our 200th anniversary in December of 2017 when they opened the History Museum and the Civil Rights Museum. The question is, Russ, for the 10 years that Mississippi had, quote, seceded from the Union, did we celebrate our anniversary early? Were we a state during those years that we had, quote, seceded?
So one, I didn't anticipate being interviewed today.
Sorry.
But I'll answer your question.
But I was also answering it rhetorically.
I will give you an off-the-cuff response. I think it's still appropriate to celebrate the fact that we existed for 200 years.
The U.S. Supreme Court agreed with you because in a Supreme Court case during Reconstruction involving the state of Texas and some financial bonds, the Supreme Court ruled that a state cannot leave the Union unilaterally. LQC Lamar and Jefferson Davis and others who crafted the Articles of Secession and that the legislature voted on in 1861 specifically said Mississippi was a sovereign state and could make up its own mind about whether it was part of the United States or not. U.S. Supreme Court disagreed and said you can't leave unilaterally. So what happened, which was all news to me, Russ, the only thing that happened was that our 2 U.S. senators and our 5 congressmen just resigned from Congress and left, came back to Mississippi in the winter of 1861 when the legislature voted to secede. And because Congress has almost unilateral authority under the Constitution to determine the qualifications of its members, Congress said in order for Mississippi and other southern states to send senators and representatives back, you've got to do the following. You've got to host a constitutional convention. You got to vest black men with the right to vote. You have to affirm the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution and other requirements before we will recognize senators and representatives of Mississippi. And I knew none of that. You and I grew up separated from the Union, rejoined the Union, but those were words that were not true. That never happened. The only thing that happened was Mississippi and other southern states lost representation in Congress, and it took 8 years in order to regain that.
That makes sense because, in some ways, the position of the Union always was that these states are in rebellion, but
That's
not
correct.
that these states had the legal authority to do what they were doing.
That's right.
And so that makes sense to me. So back to sort of my original sort of question there, though, is like, setting aside whether or not it was a state or not for 10 years, like what from the period of Reconstruction did you learn about in this process that you thought, man, I never knew that, or man, that's fascinating? I'm looking for some nuggets.
Well, virtually everything I learned was fascinating. You were kind enough to run an excerpt from the book on Magnolia Tribune, which was something I never knew, that during the Constitutional Convention of 1868, which was the very first time that black men were allowed to vote, black men were allowed to serve as delegates to the convention, serve as officers of the convention, along with white men, mostly Republican white men, some white Democrats. And in crafting a brand new constitution for the state, they created a separate article requiring the legislature to create a comprehensive statewide system of public education, which had never existed before in Mississippi. And what's remarkable, Russ, is that the template that they created in the convention and then that the legislature subsequently adopted in 1870 is essentially the same system we use today. County school districts, municipal schools districts, a statewide Department of Education, a statewide superintendent of education, elected school officials, some appointed school officials. Even though the state is demographically almost opposite and geographically almost opposite of what it was in 1870, we still use the same way of governing and controlling schools in Mississippi. And that all dates back to Reconstruction.
Yeah, no, it is fascinating because I think since then there's been a lot of conversation, obviously, about whether or not that original system set up is the right system for today, right? We certainly had that debate in 2015 with Initiative 42 and a desire to maybe expand some of the constitutional protections that were afforded around public education. Obviously, I was a part of that debate back then, where I thought that it was potentially problematic to take control away from the legislature and kind of put it in the hands of the court system. I know there are people who disagreed with me on that.
We did.
And then, and it turned out the way it turned out. But I will say that obviously there's some of those conversations going on even now around like what's the long-term sort of appearance of public education. I think everybody, I shouldn't say everybody because I'm sure there's somebody out there that just thinks we shouldn't be funding schools. I think the majority of sane people believe that there's value in investing in public education.
Well, sure.
I think the contours of that is like, what does that actually look like?
Right.
Dating back to Thomas Jefferson, there was at least a thought that there was real value in the investment of public funds into education societally, because you would have more contributors, right? You would have people who are prepared to go out and take advantage of the world. So I do think that the idea that the foundations of our existing system came out of that Reconstruction period is interesting, if for no other reason that occasionally we should probably revisit these things and figure out if the system is working the way we intended it.
Well, it certainly worked during that time period because we were a rural state. There were no large cities in Mississippi, and counties were sort of the organizing function of government. And people lived in counties. They didn't live in cities or villages, and it made sense to create a governing school system based on that. That's not the case anymore. I mean, you can. The framers of the 1869 Constitution that created that school system model would never have ever thought that 600,000 people would live in a 3-county Jackson metro area.
Yeah. No, I mean, that makes sense to me. I mean, at some level, I've always been a big believer in decentralization of these things, right? A sort of a recognition that every community is different, that every community has kids with different needs. And the less centralization, the more opportunity to adapt to unique needs of communities and kids. But it makes sense that at that time, it was like, hey,
it made sense.
How do you institute something that's never existed before and create some degree of uniformity? In the article that you shared with us, it was interesting to me that you went through sort of the details of the debate. And, on one hand, a recognition in the original authorizing legislation that like all kids should have access to this, right? And we don't want to create a separate system. But later in the same paragraph, basically saying, hey, if 25 parents object, then a district can create a separate system.
It was the compromised way to get it done, obviously.
But I mean, it almost ensured a segregated school system, right?
It ensured a segregated school system once the coalition of black and white Republicans broke apart. Yeah. As long as the Republican Party could create a majority composed of black and white Mississippians, then it could ensure that it would not develop like that. But when that coalition broke apart in the gubernatorial election of 1873, you could pretty much see how Reconstruction would end.
We're talking with Jere Nash today about his new book on Reconstruction in Mississippi. What is sure to be a fascinating read. You can pick it up at all local bookstores. Lemuria in the Jackson area. I'm sure lots of other bookstores. I'm sure Square Books has it up in Oxford.
Yes, sir.
From University Press. When we come back from the break, I want to talk a little bit about the federal imposition that allowed for the politics of Reconstruction.
Sure.
And we will be right back.
Radio reading service of Mississippi.
Together through the years, together in the future. MPB, your stories, our mission.
At the Mississippi Arts and Entertainment Experience in Meridian, we believe in the power of the arts, storytelling, and education, just like Mississippi Public Broadcasting. MPB connects communities across the state with quality programs that inform, inspire, and engage. Their audience is loyal and appreciative of businesses that support public broadcasting, which makes underwriting on MPB a smart investment. Join us in supporting MPB. Learn more at mpbfoundation.org.
Hello, I'm Desiree Frazier, host of the award-winning news program, Mississippi Edition. We bring you conversations about the latest news from across the Magnolia State. Whether it's politics, healthcare, or education, you'll hear in-depth discussions on issues that matter to you. So join us each weekday morning at 8:30 on MPB Think Radio, or download the podcast, listen through the app, and online.
Sit down right here on MPB Think Radio. I'm your host, Russ Latino. My guest today is author Jere Nash, talking about Reconstruction in Mississippi, his new book that is out on Reconstruction, available in bookstores, available on Amazon. He'll be touring the state here shortly. I know the Lemuria signing coming up on October 14th, but I bet, Jere, do you have a website where people can see where else you'll be?
No, but I will. It's on the University Press website. If you go to the University Press, search for me, they have those book signings listed.
Okay. So is it just universitypress.com, or do you know?
I'm pretty bad at promoting myself. But if you Google University
we'll get
Press,
Germaine to pull it up, and we'll get you
go.
at the end of the program.
Right.
So we talked about sort of the impact on creating a public system of education during Reconstruction. It's the thing that I mentioned earlier when you were asking me about my view of Reconstruction, that I recalled, learning about Hiram Revels going to the U.S. Senate, even though he was only there for a very short period of time. Blanche K. Bruce went after him and served a full term in the U.S. Senate. You had Alexander Davis, who was the lieutenant governor of the state of Mississippi. John R. Lynch, I think, was the Speaker of the House in the 1870s.
He was the second Republican Speaker of the House and the first black Republican Speaker.
So you had all of these black leaders who were in the highest positions coming out of Mississippi. And I think that a lot of people seeing that would view it as some sort of abnormality, not in the sense that there can't be great black leaders, but in that period of history, it seems odd that you would go from a civil war to a complete change in the type of representation you had. And I was asking you off air, what allowed for that?
You and I have been doing politics for a while, and one of the expressions you and I would always see in the media, which I never really focused on that much. In 1986, when Mike Espy was elected to Congress, everybody said the first black congressman in Mississippi since Reconstruction. When Kirk Fordyce was elected in 1991, the first Republican governor in Mississippi since Reconstruction, or when the Republicans took control of the House in 2011, those statements just sort of appear in the media, but you don't ever stop back and think, you mean there was a black congressman from Mississippi before Mike Espy, or there were Republicans, like you say, in high office before now, and it was all because Republicans in Congress, the same Republicans that Wirt Yerger and Clark Reed and Billy Munger had to fight off in the 1950s, that sort of image of Republicans in Congress, just what you just said, forcing their own views on Mississippi in the 10 years after the war by imposing military control on Mississippi, by telling the military to register black men as well as white men. Mississippi, that meant so much because only Mississippi and South Carolina were majority black. 55% of Mississippians were African American at the time. So that had much more of an impact on our politics in Arkansas or Alabama or North Carolina, say, where very quickly white Democrats were able to regain control of their government, but not here.
Yeah, and that's something that I did not know, that we were 55% black in that time period. I mean, obviously today we're slightly under 40%. I think it may be 38 or 39% African American in Mississippi. And so, I mean, clearly during the period that followed Reconstruction, where the pendulum swung back, you had sort of a mass exodus of black citizens going to other parts of the country.
Not until the 1920s, the Great Migration. If you look at the census data from 1870 to 1920, the black percentage of the population grew as high as 62% during the 1890s to 1920s. And then by then, Vardaman and Bilbo had taken over government. Jim Crow became so ugly and so all-encompassing and so defining of the state's culture that all over the South, as you know, blacks left, and 20 years later, Mississippi was majority white.
It is. It's fascinating to reflect on the history and sort of the political changes, because obviously during that period, we're talking about African American voters being predominantly Republican. Yeah. Today, obviously, African American voters are predominantly Democrat. You're talking about white voters who were predominantly Democrat.
Dyed in the wool Democratic voters.
Correct. Yeah. And today you've got the exact opposite. And you saw that sort of sea shift or change really occur in the 1960s in terms of strategies of both parties. And a lot of it had to do with John F. Kennedy and obviously the Civil Rights Act and some of the things that Democrats were pushing at that time. or at least some Democrats were pushing at that time. Certainly, those things also had strong Republican support, or some of them had
no question
strong
all
Republican support at the time.
Yeah.
And so I kind of wonder, and we'll close the show with your brief thoughts on this. We've seen transitions in parties before. Do you think it's possible we're experiencing a shift in parties today?
Again, I'm gonna make a shameless plug for our third edition of our book because we explore that very question about how all of this has happened and what it may look like in the future. I think for the short term, Russ, we've sort of transformed the parties into what they are: a very conservative Republican Party, a very liberal Democratic Party with very little in between. But what's unfortunate is that those partisanships have become very hard. When you and I were growing up in the 60s and 70s, those partisanships were malleable. You could create coalitions around certain issues like anti-communism or free international trade that you can't even do that today. And that's what we got to fix.
I think that's a good word to end on. Germaine,
I've got that. I've got that for you. It's upress.state.ms.us.
Well, that is a load.
But she can put that in the YouTube comments,
There
right?
Yeah, that too.
There you go.
And just Google it.
Yeah, just Google University Press of Mississippi and it'll pop up.
That's right.
Thank you guys for a great show. The Sit Down is a production of Mississippi Public Broadcasting Think Radio, made possible thanks to generous support from listeners like you. If you enjoy the guests and sit-downs we bring each week, please consider making a contribution to help us keep shows like this on the air. Visit mpbonline.org or show your support using the MPB app. Today's show was co-produced by Germaine Flood with live stream production by Abram Nanny and Kevin Farrell. For my guest, Jere Nash, I'm Russ Latino. Stay tuned for Southern Remedy right here at 11 a.m. and join us here next week for a new episode of The Sit Down, only on MPB Think Radio.